It's good to be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. No less than Hockey Night in Canada's Ron MacLean is called tonight's guest, one of hockey's ultimate secret agents. And anyone who's read one of Eric Zweig's books written over the past 30 years or perused the tales he spins at his website, ericzweig.com, knows how true that is. So, minus his trench coat, we welcome back to Hockey Time Machine, secret agent Eric Zweig.
Hello. That original Ron MacLean intro had a lot of James Bond references that I told him, we're going to have to tame that down a little bit. And he was like, oh, I am shaken but not stirred that you don't see yourself as James Bond.
Do I expect you to talk, Mr. Zweig? No, I expect you to die.
Yeah, thanks.
No, wait. That's wrong. This is a talk show. I do expect you to talk.
Hopefully I don't die.
We invited Eric on to discuss his newest book, one that isn't even really officially out yet. This is it. Engraved in History, the story of the Kenora Thistles, the story of the Stanley Cup champion, Kenora Thistles. So, Eric, we're going to take a deep dive into the Thistles, which I hope is not too painful.
Yes, it sounds worse than hopefully it will be.
Eric, is it true that your interest in the Thistles began with a toy Stanley Cup?
Yeah, funny you should mention it. Ta-da! Toy Stanley Cup. My parents bought a set of miniature NHL trophies for my brothers and me for a Hanukkah gift about 1973. And you can see it is engraved. It doesn't have the player names, but it has the team names from 1893 to 1972, which is when it was made. That was the first I'd ever heard of the Kenora Thistles. There was a little booklet that came with the trophies as well, but it just listed the team names again. But that was when I first heard of them. I was 9 or 10. And it was just, I don't know, the name, the romance of a name, and the fact that a town so small of homegrown players could win the Stanley Cup. I mean, this is what time when I'm just sort of coming to hockey and I know the Maple Leafs and the Canadiens and Boston won the Cup in 72. Like, big cities win the Stanley Cup, not tiny little towns. And I'd always sort of kept that in mind. I mean, it was years before I sort of officially became, affiliated with hockey and became, like to call myself a hockey historian. But that was probably the very first sense of it.
You brought up names. Let's start our journey to far Western Ontario here. These were the nicknames you uncovered for some of the players on a 19th century Kenora team. Undertaker, Dinky, Silver, Pink Eye, Circus, Farmer, and my personal favorite, Slops.
Yeah, there was no explanation.
What was the origin of the Thistles?
Well, those nicknames. So the Thistles as a hockey team, there are lots of stories about how the team started, and the dates jumble around a bit. They're all sort of the same. But I think I've come pretty close to, finding out how it really started. And it is in 1893. there was a couple of recent comers to the city who had played some hockey and started sort of organizing the team in town. The whole story is a little more involved than that. But by 1894, the 1893-94 winter, but really like January of 1894, is when they start playing as a team and playing against other teams. And that those nicknames came from a tour the Thistles made. It was a sort of, when the Russians came over in 72 and even though they've been winning world championships for all that time, it was sort of like a mission of exploring and learning and this really truly was. Like the Thistles had been playing hockey for weeks at this point, and we're going to Winnipeg where people had been playing for at least a few years. And they came back from this road trip with these nicknames. It was not explained how they got them. Some of them are maybe a little more obvious than others, but it was yeah, there's so much stuff in the newspapers in the early days. I mean, when you really start looking, there's lots of fun stories. That's what I really like about this era.
Part of what I do want to discuss with you while I have you on is the era, not just the Thistles. As you did in your book, you expanded to educate and entertain us with stories about hockey at the turn of the 20th century. So one of the things we should explain, and by we, I mean you, are the different levels of hockey at that time, senior and intermediate and so on.
Well, it's funny, except for the fact that there's not a lot of intermediate hockey anymore. There's still senior amateur hockey in Canada, and they still play for the Allen Cup. It's just not what it used to be. I mean, people know junior hockey, where the Canadian Hockey League and some of the American junior leagues too. But that's sort of the same junior level that it's been since the 1890s. It's just that instead of having intermediate and senior, though, as I say, there is still intermediate and there's senior, we just think of the pros and the different levels like the NHL, the AHL, the EHL, kind of like baseball, AAA and AA. But in the 1890s and for much of the early part of the 20th century, there was junior hockey, senior hockey, and intermediate hockey, very separate from professional hockey. It wasn't necessarily a breeding ground for professional players, though most of the pro players did come up through that level. And in 1890s, when Kenora, it was interesting, and I have to explain it to various people who were early readers, that in Kenora, they referred to in Rat Portage at the time, before Kenora was called Kenora, it was called Rat Portage. In Rat Portage, the top team in town was known as the senior team, but they played in the intermediate division of the Manitoba Hockey League, Manitoba Hockey Association, actually. So it's always tricky to know, like, do we call them seniors? Do we call them the intermediates? And I kind of twist myself around in some of the early chapters trying to get the terminology in a way that people will understand. But it was very simple. Junior hockey was, as it is now, like the younger level. I think it was under 21. I think it's under 20 now, but it was under 21 you played as a junior. Intermediate was generally the caliber more than the age. Like once you moved up, you could become a senior or an intermediate depending on the caliber you were playing at. And in Manitoba, Winnipeg was the real, they controlled senior hockey, and all the other Manitoba towns, and Kenora's in Ontario, but they played in Manitoba because they're so much closer to the Manitoba border than to any of the big population centers in Ontario. So intermediate hockey was where the small towns played and the farm teams of the senior teams in Winnipeg. But it sounds confusing, but it isn't. It was really the sort of development system, and it's not all that different from hockey today, really.
Shocking. I say that a town named Rat Portage would want to change its name. But
the story is that, and it's interesting, like Rat Portage, the name Rat Portage is actually engraved on the Stanley Cup in 1903 when they lost to Ottawa. But the story goes that the Maple Leaf Flour Company was going to be milling flour and did not want the word rat emblazoned on the bags of flour that they were selling, and that they made the big push to change the name. I don't know that it's true, but it's certainly a widely held myth and a long told story.
Okay, let me deviate. And I wasn't going to ask you this, but part of your job as a historian and as an author is to separate the wheat from the chaff. What's the legend? What's the truth? And sometimes people like hanging on to the legend. So how difficult is it a job for a historian and an author to say, you know what? this didn't really happen, or the real story isn't nearly as interesting as the legend.
Well, it's funny. Like, I feel like that's kind of my job. I know that, I sort of have this little bit of a reputation as a myth buster in the hockey stories, and it kind of happened by accident. When we did the first edition of Total Hockey in 1998, and we'd sort of, I mean, there had been guys like Ernie Fitzsimmons and others who had been collecting statistics for years. And they'd never really been super well integrated to what the NHL had or what NHL people had done. When I was working on the guide and record book, we always tried to get their stats going right back to like their last year before junior hockey. But that was, from the 90s and 2000s. But Ernie and guys like that had been doing this forever. And when we started putting all the stats together and then comparing them with the historic biographies that had always been written, because the back of the first edition of Total Hockey had about 300 player biographies too, which we mostly just reworked from previous sources. But once we started having what were way more official statistics than had been gathered before, and all in one place, you'd start seeing, like, I remember specifically a story about Bill Durnan, first drawing attention. I don't remember the team, playing in Newmarket, I think, in 1934, but he'd actually played in Newmarket in 1933. I mean, it's not a big deal, but once you have the numbers there to go with the story and the stories don't line up with the numbers, you start having to make the changes. So really, I just sort of started doing it by accident, like reading these biographies and comparing them with the numbers we had. And then more and more, the more it's become easier to search online. I mean, when you used to have to do this in microfilm and you'd go to a library and you'd load up the reel and you'd be cranking through it, and you'd actually get like motion sickness from the way the stuff moved. But now I sit at my desk at home, I call up a newspaper, I can search for a specific term, and it still helps sometimes to go page by page, but you can find so many things. And so often, I mean, even if it's just like, the year is wrong or the team name is different, there's almost always something. That's again what I like about the old days. Like, all this stuff now is so streamlined and slick and professional, and it should be. But the old days was a little more just flying by the seat of your pants, and guys writing in newspapers that, didn't necessarily know about what they were covering and just kind of reported what they saw. And because there was no replay to check, and you couldn't, well, let's check the tape. There was none of that. So the stories would get just transmuted over the years. Like, I mean, stories about how Cyclone Taylor got his nickname, or where he was when he was born, even, like the dates change, the names change, the stories change. They're all similar but different. And now when you can check it against so many things that were written in the paper at the time, you can't always prove what happened, but you get, a preponderance of the evidence to show it was like this, not like that. And it often changes the story as we've known it. And I mean, I don't like to lie. I like to get to the true story. And that's sort of like what I hope I'm doing, and doing it in a fun way. It's not like, hey, you dummies, you're wrong and I'm right. Though I do quietly feel like that a lot. But like the big story in this one, in Kenora, the story has always been that in 1896, the group of young kids in town challenged the senior team. It's this junior versus senior challenge. And the story was that it happened in 1896, and that the junior team so trimmed the seniors that they all just kind of threw their sticks and gloves on the ice and walked away from hockey forever. And that's been the story as it's been told in Kenora at least since the 1950s, and maybe since the 1890s. But I'd never seen a firsthand account. There is a letter, and I quote the letter in the book. I've seen photocopies of it, though the letter is reproduced in a newspaper. It's not like I've never seen the actual letter. And it's interesting to know if maybe there was a, like when on the old typewriters, if you struck it wrong, like you didn't get the letter would be like, I wonder if this 1896 date of the letter was actually 1898 or 1899, which is when it seems like the game was actually played. But this is, I mean, it's really interesting. I haven't heard yet, I don't know how married to this story and legend people in Kenora are, though it's certainly all over the internet. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen like it's always been told. It happened at least 3 years later, and differently than the story always goes. I won't explain too much about it because it's a good chunk of explanatory stuff in the book, which I hope you'll all buy and read. But that's a big one, and I don't know what the people in Kenora think yet about having their long-held myths adjusted. It hasn't really been proven untrue. It's just been proven to be not quite the way it was always told.
Next, you're going to tell me Abner Doubleday didn't invent baseball.
You know, you're going to have John Thorne on about that, but he didn't.
La 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 la. So at the turn of the 20th century, back to hockey, it was quite a different game. And I'd like you to go over some of the rules differences, the number of players on the ice, the passing rules, and so on.
Yeah, the biggest differences, if you were to, you know, take a time machine and travel back to the 1890s, 1900s, right until almost the 1920s. But in the early days of hockey, well, the organized hockey, well, we won't go back too much to the really, you know, ancient, but, you know, it was played with 7 men instead of 6 on the ice at a time. So the extra position, the positions as we know them now, the 3 forwards, the goalie, the defenseman, though the defensemen were referred to as point and cover point, which I believe is a term from lacrosse, though I don't know if they still use that in lacrosse. In theory, though, it doesn't work quite as rigidly as this. Like, you know, forwards concentrated on being forwards and sort of scoring. Defensemen stayed back in their own end to help the goalie. And the rover was the only guy who could sort of, that's why he was called the rover, I guess. He could go anywhere on the ice. He would pitch in and help with the forwards. He would come back and help with the defense. I mean, the Thistles were among the first teams where the defensemen jumped up in the rush and were expected to carry the puck and bring it to the forwards rather than the what's the word I'm looking for? The way it was done prior to that was that defensemen basically just was almost like punting in football. A defenseman would shoot the puck from his end, loft a long high shot into the other end. Now you would be offside if you were ahead of the play on that. So the offensive team couldn't retrieve the puck. You'd have to let the other team get it and then get it back for them, which is why I say it's like punting in football. Like it would clear the puck out of your end, out of trouble, but you gave up possession. Because the other big change is the passing rules. There was no forward passing, or at least limited forward passing. I mean, you could pass the puck ahead as long as the player who retrieved the puck had been behind you when you put the puck forward and then kind of caught up to it. But basically, there was no forward passing. And I kind of described the style of the offense plays offense and the defense plays defense as like a table hockey game where, you know, guys are set in their rigid slots and they can't go anywhere on the ice. Again, that sort of is a simplified version of it, but gives a kind of mental image for at least those of us old enough to have played table hockey as opposed to Nintendo or whatever. So that's the big difference, is that it's a 7 men, the no forward passing. The ice had very few markings on it, but I mean, there were no blue lines yet. There was no center red line. There weren't even goal lines until the early 1900s. So it would look a little bit different that way. The players have less padding, though, you know, all the sort of basic equipment except helmets and masks for goalies that we know now, but just much smaller and not as protective. But the game was super rough anyway. The Thistles were always known as a clean team, but you certainly read enough accounts of games where guys are rolling and tumbling and not so much fighting, but lots of stick work. That's probably something we'd notice for sure, is how much slashing and hooking and charging and cross-checking and butt-ending there was. I mean, if you went back in time, it would look like a different game, but not so different that you would go, what are they playing out there? You'd recognize it as hockey, but different hockey. I mean, often even in those days, they would sort of call it shinny as opposed to hockey, or differentiate what was like the earliest references to the Thistles playing. The guy who's telling the story goes, you know, it was really just shinny. But it was, you'd recognize the game, but it would definitely be different.
Well, our friend John Faoli of Soho Table Hockey would like everybody to know that table hockey is alive and well to this day, and they have tournaments and use African wood on the sideboards, and it's
I love those great big table hockey games. I can't remember the company that makes them, but they're gorgeous.
Well, speaking about the players staying in their lanes like a table hockey game, you mentioned that players kind of had to do that to pace themselves, because another thing about hockey back then was you played the whole game.
Yeah, substitutions only in case of extreme injury. And even at that, rather than letting you get a fresh player on the ice, the other team was equally likely to go, you know what, your guy's hurt, we'll drop a guy and we'll play 6-on-6, rather than give your team the advantage of a fresh man on the ice, though it wouldn't probably be as good a player, because if he was good enough, he'd have been a starter. But yeah, you basically played the full 60 minutes, and there would be injury timeouts, like guys would have to go off and get stitched up, but they'd give you 10 minutes and you'd come back. That's a key difference, is that guys played 60 minutes. I asked an old timer once, when I had done my first book, Hockey Night in the Dominion of Canada, a relative, I guess he was a nephew of Frank and Lester Patrick, who had gone to games in the 20s in Victoria in the PCHA. And I said, because even then the PCHA kept 7 men and didn't have a lot of substitutions. I said, what was it like? And he said, well, they came out fast and they got slower as the game went on. And I've often wondered if guys who would say, Cyclone Taylor was the fastest guy we ever saw, if it wasn't so much that he was faster, but had the stamina to keep his speed longer and deeper into the game than other guys, and so just seemed faster as the game went on. I've never, that's a theory I can't prove one way or another. I mean, it's equally likely that he was just really fast, but I think they had tremendous stamina. And like a guy like Tommy Phillips, who's the captain of the Thistles, is always remarked on how, he could play a full 60 minutes and be, fresh as a daisy at the end and still as fast as he'd been at the beginning. And I think that was, I don't know that that's a skill you can develop, but if you had that kind of stamina and were able to do it, it was a huge advantage.
Since you mentioned Lester Patrick, he was around in the area at that time. I think this is a 1904 photo. What was the legendary Lester Patrick doing in Brandon those days?
Well, it's interesting. Both Lester Patrick and Art Ross, who were friends in Montreal and had played, hockey in Montreal, obviously, kind of had their breakthrough out west playing in Brandon. The story, it's told in Eric Whitehead's Hockey's Royal Family about, that Lester Patrick was kind of getting antsy in Montreal, wasn't happy at school, had dropped out of school, was working for his dad for a little bit, and then decided to just, go west, young man, and went out west to Calgary in 1903 and wanted to be a ranch hand, but couldn't really ride a horse. Found some work doing, I think, laying track for the CPR, and then was coming back on his way home to Montreal, stopped off in Brandon, where a couple of people he knew from Montreal had come out west to play hockey that year, and he was recruited to play for Brandon. I don't think they're called the Wheat Kings or even the Wheat City team. People refer to them as the Wheat City team, but I think that was just the nickname of Brandon, was the Wheat City. Like, I think they're just technically the Brandon Hockey Club, but he was recruited to play for Brandon. And it's interesting, 1903-04, that's the 1 year in a stretch of 5 that Kenora doesn't win the Manitoba Championship. And Brandon and Lester Patrick beat them out. It was a pretty tight race. He wasn't yet, internationally famous as Lester Patrick, but this was the first kind of breakout year for him as a hockey star. And, that's a young him in the team picture.
Speaking about the Thistles, a couple things about the rover position. You allude in the book that the newspaper writers from other cities were somewhat miffed at the Thistles, wrote somewhat derisively about the fact that they might have other players who would leave their straight line of their lane, which was very innovative, I guess, for the period.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like I said, they were the first team that really sort of, insisted, overstates it, but their strategy called for, whenever possible, the defenseman rush the puck up the ice. Lester Patrick is often credited as one of the first rushing defensemen, and he did it in Brandon in that 1903-04 season, but more than likely picked it up from seeing the Kenora players do it. He also might have picked it up because he'd seen Mike Grant when he was a kid in Montreal doing it. But Billy McGimsey telling the stories later was like, yeah, we were rushing the puck here long before Lester Patrick was. So that was a prize theory, a strategy of theirs, that defensemen bring the puck, and that was often chastised by others. They didn't pass a lot because they rushed so fast. They were all known for being such fast skaters. They were all wearing tube skates, which were a fairly new invention at the time, and so they were really fast. And Art Ross talks about how they were so fast they almost couldn't be a passing team. Though there's plenty of stories of at least working 2-man pass patterns. But the thing, like Tommy Phillips, who played every position, and maybe this is why he would move around on the ice so much because, he played as a rover. He played as a point and cover point. He played, never really seen much as a center, but he played left and right wing. But as a left winger, he would often, like, if he came down the left side and didn't find an opening, would circle back and go around to the right side. And people just found this like unheard of and odd, and that, it was always like he could shoot equally well from the left or the right, but it wasn't always a compliment. It was like, stay in your lane, kid. And it's interesting, like this is sort of what the Russians did when they came over in '72. And the Winnipeg Jets and the WHA, I think, were the first sort of North American team to really make this a strategy, and the Oilers borrowed it in the NHL. I compare the Thistles a lot to the Oilers. I mean, the times are extremely different, but the teams are similar in a lot of ways.
All right, hold that thought, because you mentioned Billy McGimsey, and here he is, obviously driving to the game, and in a luxury vehicle, much like today's players.
It's a pretty cool car
for 1903. Yeah.
I got to think that's a little later than that, but I don't know a year on this. But yeah, it's pretty cool.
So what do we know about Billy McGimsey and after he got to the rink?
Well, it's McGimsey. Well, I always thought it was McGimsey. It looks so McGimsey, but the family has told me it's McGimsey. Craig Patrick at the Hockey Hall of Fame had long said it was McGimsey, but I still had a hard time, even though I know it was the same woman who told me, who is his granddaughter. It still seemed hard to believe. But anyway, so he was, all the Thistles were fast. He was their center. He was a big scorer. I kind of doubt he's going to the game because basically, hockey was played in the winter in those days, and there's no snow on the ground in that picture. I got some of the pictures from the family, and that was a great one. I sent that. Yeah, that was not in the book, but I sent it to you because it's just such a cool picture.
Okay. It's amazing to me when I read in the book that the Thistles traveled too fast to pass the puck. Hard to believe. And you mentioned Art Ross. This is what he said years later. The fastest collection of players ever gotten together was the Kenora Thistles. And there's two reasons, I think, that you identify why the Thistles were so fast. One was the unique skate blades that I want to have you talk about in a second. But also one player saying there was nothing much to do after work in Brandon except skate. And I never skated so much in my life.
Yeah, that's Art Ross as well. I mean, that was a story that I found when I was doing my Art Ross biography a few years ago. That story, he apparently told that story to Lester Patrick. Lester Patrick told it to Dink Carroll, or one of the Montreal writers, and he wrote it. I mean, this is many years later, but yeah, that before he went out to Brandon in 1905. I mean, Art Ross as a young man was more known as a football player, a rugby player. Well, rugby football, they always called them, but it's football more than rugby. He was a rugby football player and a hockey player second, because he wasn't a great skater. They said, he could stick handle. He was strong and smart, but he wasn't a great skater. And apparently out in Brandon, when he skated all the time, he just I don't know, found the knack. Maybe he came back with tube skates, though you never hear that. But the Thistles were all said to be fast. And I think, maybe because they grew up in Kenora or Rat Portage and had nothing to do in the winter except skate. Though I think the tube skates are a big part of their speed and strategy, and we can.
Well, tell me why are the tube skates considered unique for the time? Why were they such an innovation over what everybody else was using?
Yeah, well, I guess we don't have any pictures of that unless you've got something. Like like figure skates, the skate blades were attached directly to the boot of the skate. And it's funny, like with the newer blades, that's kind of like that again. But I don't really know enough about the mechanics of how it worked. But rather than fastening the blades directly to the bottom of the boot, a steel bar is sort of attached to the bottom of the boot, and then it's the tube. And then the skate blade on the ice is attached to that. I don't know how it works or why it's better. But I think it was just a little more stable, so you could turn sharper and and change direction better. I think you could stop and start and change direction better. It was apparently, first perhaps even in Germany, I think, speed skaters. And Kenora, again, I guess because it was winter and you had to find something to do, Kenora had a lot of good speed skaters. One of the older brothers of Tough Bellefield, who was a Kenora player, though he's not on the Stanley Cup team, so he's not as well known as he might have been otherwise. He was a Canadian champion speed skater and had been using the tube skates. And a couple of guys in Kenora sort of shortened the blade and came up with the tube for the hockey players in town, and they all wore them. Billy McJimsey tells this story too, that the two guys in Kenora never patented it. So a couple of guys in Winnipeg, Jimmy Boswell and somebody else, McCullough or something like that, are actually kind of credited with inventing tube skates because they were the ones who patented it. But they were the two guys in Rat Portage who did it first. And it's interesting that they were kind of slow to catch on because everybody remarked on how fast the Thistles were. And you'd think everybody would want the skates, but it seemed to take a while before other teams cottoned on.
One more topic we should cover before we get into the Thistles Stanley Cup runs, and that is how rough the game was back then. You mentioned it briefly earlier, but I want to discuss it in some more detail. It actually will come up in connection with the Thistles. But as you point out in the book, players didn't wear very much padding, but they took a lot of liberties.
It's funny, like sports in the 1900s, the 1890s and 1900s were just really rough. I mean, I've never seen a great theory to explain this. People talk about, the pioneer roots and life was rugged and tough, and it was. I mean, I guess if you expected, you could die in childbirth or die as a 8-year-old, I mean, you didn't care as much about, hey, whack me with a hockey stick. So what? I'm alive. I'm here. I don't know. That's a personal theory. But the game was extremely rough. But it's interesting, like in the 1890s, the Baltimore Orioles, who are not related to the current Baltimore Orioles, but they were the top team in, I guess, the National League in the 1890s and played dirty. Like this is John McGraw and Wee Willie Keeler, and I can't remember some of the other names, but they would like, because there were fewer umpires on the field, like they would grab a guy's belt as he went by and hold him, and then so he couldn't go from first to third on a single, he could only go from first to second. And they would apparently hide balls in the outfield, and if a ball got past them, they just pick up the one in front of them and throw it in. And baseball was sort of known, and because again they were successful, so other teams copied it. Hockey was kind of the same. It was very rough, and the Ottawa, we know them as the Ottawa Silver Seven. They were Stanley Cup champions, and they were rough as could be and dirty. And because they were rough and dirty and champions, like the Philadelphia Flyers in the 70s, people copied it. I mean, I don't know what comes first. Was the game violent anyway, and Ottawa just got really good at it, or did the game become more violent because Ottawa was good at it? But yeah, it was rough. I mean, lots of, as I said, not a lot of actual fighting, but stick swinging and slashing and butt ends and cross checks. That's also, and I make the point, like people who weren't in Ottawa hated Ottawa, and the violence was kind of played up whenever, like the Marlboros in 1904, the Winnipeg Rowing Club in 1903, go into Ottawa and lose Stanley Cup series and are beat up pretty badly. And the papers in their hometowns are, oh, if it was real hockey, we could have kept with them. But, when it's wrestling on the ice, we can't keep up. So you never know how much of it is sour grapes. But I think Ottawa also sort of delighted in their rough reputation. Though they also would go, yeah, if we play clean, we'll beat you that way too. And they often did. But yeah, it was a very rough game. Partly it's just like players with sticks in their hands and blades on their feet in an enclosed surface. It's going to be violent. I mean, you collide. But it was even more violent than it seems like it ever had to be. And I don't really know why, but it was.
Well, if they really want to bring fans back to baseball and add excitement to the game, they need to readopt those John McGraw Orioles rules.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's something you pulled, not involving Kenora. It's from the March 4th, 1899 issue of a Quebec newspaper.
Yeah,
blew me away. Quote, they were previewing a game. They should order 7 full suits of armor and as many coffins in order to be prepared for all emergencies.
Yeah,
Wow.
so you get the idea. It was a rough game. I mean, like this was when Queen's University in 1899 challenged the Montreal Victorias, I guess, who weren't considered a particularly violent team, but yeah, these sports writers are warning the college kids, get ready. It's not the game you're used to.
Oh, well, I guess they only needed one-way train tickets.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. On to the Thistles. You pose this question in the book. How was it possible that a group of boys, all growing up in a tiny wilderness town, could go from playing together in high school to becoming the champions of Canada in less than 8 years? So I want to take that question in pieces, but what's the genesis that led up to the 3 Stanley Cup runs? How did they start out as high school kids? Give me the start to that answer.
Well, most of the guys on the team, I mean, they do add some ringers as it gets close to the finish. But they'd all grown up together in Kenora and were all within a couple years old of each other. Cy Griffiths, who's one of the big stars and a Hockey Hall of Famer, was a latecomer to town. He moved when he was a young teenager, so probably didn't start playing with the other guys until high school. But a lot of them had, like played in. There's always I never found any. I've read stories in clippings about them talking about playing in church leagues and park leagues, though I don't have a firsthand source of that. But even if they didn't, I mean, they were playing as kids. It's a small town. I mean, I think the athletic families would have known each other. They would have, I mean, maybe they were competing with or against each other, but there would have been the same group of kids for a long time growing up and playing together. I mean, many of them, and they aren't all the same age, but they are within a couple of years of each other. So even if, like I'm a grade ahead of you, we might still be on the same school team. I mean, for sure, Tommy Phillips and Tom Hooper were stars on the local high school team. Cy Griffiths played for that team. Roxy Boudreau played for that team. McJimsey's a year or two older, so probably had been ahead of them, though they might have played on school teams. There's pictures of them quite young of McJimsey and Phillips on the same team. Some of it gets a little confusing because there was sort of the senior team in town, which I said played in the intermediate league, and the junior team in town, and there was no junior league yet, so they just played whoever. There also was the school team. There were drugstore teams and banker teams and doctor teams and lawyer teams. I mean, it's hockey was booming. That's part of how they could get so good so quickly, is because there was just so much hockey in the 1890s. I mean, the game really, you can start a good fight with hockey historians as to when and where was the game invented, but really the game we point to in 1875, on March 3rd, 1875 in Montreal, is really where modern hockey starts. Later in the 1880s, and Maury Holtzman's book, The Oddfellow's Heart, is a lot about the specific guy and the circumstances of the rules that were sort of modernized to what comes closer to what we know of as hockey in 1885. But by the time these guys were growing up in the 1890s, there is the Stanley Cup, so there's a national championship trophy to aspire to. No one in Canada is being paid to play sports, but so there's not a fortune to be made, but there is fame to be gained. And these guys had long winters and lots of opportunity to play together. I mean, other Canadian cities did too, so that's not enough of a reason. There's nothing that really explains how 6 guys could kind of grow up as the same team the whole way and be this good, except that it happened. But part of it is the fact that, like, it's the first time there's something to aspire to as a national championship trophy, and I think it's really what gets them going. Because I mean, Winnipeg wins the Stanley Cup for the first time in 1896, and then hockey. It changes hockey, because until then, the Stanley Cup even had been almost like a house league trophy in the East with Ottawa, Montreal, and Quebec. And when Winnipeg wins, the trophy sort of takes on a national importance. And now it is sort of obvious to people, like, hey, we can come from anywhere and win this and be the best in the country. And I think that had to inspire them. I mean, it's interesting. It's funny. This is one of my big name drops, but Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and his book about the early professional days in Toronto. We've talked about this a little bit, about how could it happen? But it did. It was like all the circumstances were right for the game to suddenly go to another level, and it kind of does. Though, why Kenora and not Brandon or Renfrew, where they tried it as well? Everything just kind of falls into place, I guess.
I have it on good authority that when Stephen Harper is at cocktail parties, he said, I was talking to Eric Zweig, and this is
that
what
would
he
be cool
told
if
me.
he did. I kind of doubt that, but I mean, if he was in the right hockey circles, he might. I don't think his conservative politicos are all that hip to my brilliant abilities, but
Kenora plays for the Stanley Cup on 3 separate occasions. So I want to go through all of those, but first, why was the Stanley Cup known as a challenge series?
Yeah, well, in this time period and for a few years longer, hockey relies on natural ice, so it needs to be cold. And we all joke about 10 months of winter in Canada, but you need the right cold temperature. So hockey seasons basically are just late December till early March, so that it's winter and you can be assured of cold weather and hard ice in a natural surface inside an arena. There's no jets, there's no airplanes, there's only railway travel. So leagues are generally small and regional. You can't be traveling long distances for the short schedules. And guys aren't being paid, right? So they have to have jobs. So you can't take, a 3-week road trip and take a leave of absence from your work. We can talk about that a little bit too, about how professionalism starts to change in this era. But that's why. So, and Lord Stanley, when he donated it, wanted it to be a national trophy. So there had to be, a league from this region could play against the league from that region to play for the championship. And if you were the Stanley Cup champion, the trophy sort of resided in your league. And if you continued to win your league, you held the cup. If somebody knocked you off in your league championship, they would take over the trophy, but they would still be required to challenge against other leagues. So in Ottawa, for example, when the Silver Seven are Stanley Cup champions, they're playing in Eastern-based leagues, the Canadian Amateur Hockey League and some others. But and there are leagues in the Maritimes. There's leagues in Ontario. There's leagues in Manitoba. There aren't quite as many leagues further out west, but they're starting to develop. And so the system has to be set so the champions from Manitoba can challenge the champions who happen to be from Quebec or Ottawa in a series. And because the seasons are so short, the challenge might take place before the next season starts. It might take at the end of the season like the playoffs do now, or it might even be, as it was in 1907, we got to take time out from the middle of our schedule to get this championship game in, because you got to play it when you can have ice. So that's why I kind of compare it to boxing or mixed martial arts, and that if I'm the champion and you want it, you challenge me and we fight. And that's basically how it worked. You had to be the champion of a officially recognized provincial association. It couldn't be just, let's get a team together and see what happens. Though some of the teams were. Dawson City was basically that. Even when in Edmonton's Stanley Cup Challenge was a little bit of that. Renfrew was a bit of that. We'll just cobble together a team and see what happens. Kenora was more than those, a real authentic, these guys grew up together and played together. But that was how it worked. I challenge you and we see what happens. And if Kenora wins, they bring the trophy back, and suddenly the trophy belongs to the Manitoba League, and then the Quebec guys will have to challenge us. So that's how it worked.
Just after the turn of the century, there were several what you call Stanley Cup arguments. What was that all about?
I make the point in the book too. Like, I compare the Thistles to the Oilers sometimes, but I also compare the infighting and crap that goes on in sports has always been, right? Different things to fight about. Right now, the PGA and the LIV are tooth and nail about, you're terrible and we're great and this is horrible and going to ruin the game. It has ever been thus in sports. So there were arguments about, is this team eligible to play? Should this team be eligible to play? How good is the caliber of that league? There were challenges among the teams in the leagues. Like, once people start kind of sneakily trying to lure players from one team to another, it's like, well, your guy shouldn't play. He's part of that team, not this team. They fought about everything. Like, should we be pros? Should we be amateurs? Should the rules be this? Should the rules be that? We think that goal was offside. Fight. They fought about everything, and it's in the papers all the time. It's funny. Like I said, the seasons are short and it's winter, but hockey makes the news in Canadian papers year round. especially when players start jumping teams. That's always, I mean, it's not quite the free agent frenzy we see now, but there's always rumors of who's going where and is it a legitimate reason for them to go. People fought about everything. I mean, nothing changes.
I think it was Shakespeare who said, "There's nothing new under the sun," and that was in 1600.
It's very true. No, I always feel like when I'm writing my stories, it's always like, you think this is interesting. Well, we're fighting about it worse 100 years ago, or fighting about it differently, but the same. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun.
You write, the eyes of the Thistles had been on hockey's biggest prize since the start of their first senior season. So tell us about their first bid in 1903.
Yeah, well, so the Thistles had been playing juniors or intermediate hockey, because Winnipeg basically wouldn't let anybody but the Winnipeg teams into senior hockey. And in 1901-02, or actually 1900-01, the Thistles win the intermediate championship and are a powerhouse. It's most of these guys who are going to be the Stanley Cup team in a couple of years. And they're hearing from even some of the senior teams in the East who have come out West that you guys are as good as any team we have here. And so they start thinking in the 01-02 season, maybe it's time for us to move up to seniors. But they don't make an official appeal yet to become seniors until the first couple of games in the intermediate season in 1901-02. They're winning by huge scores, and they're actually worried that the team is so good and the competition can't keep up with them that it's going to hurt interest in town. And so they make a late appeal to get into the senior league. They're denied because basically the Winnipeg teams are bastards and don't want them. They play an exhibition game to see if they're good enough, and they do lose, but the circumstances were ridiculously sort of stacked against them. And everybody, like the fans in Winnipeg, seem really enthused by, let them play senior, let them get into the league. It'll reinvigorate the competition between the two Winnipeg teams that are beating each other up as seniors. But the Winnipeg teams don't let them, and they start taking heat. And the next year, there's actually a split where some of the intermediate teams break away from the league so they can form their own senior league. And that's how the Thistles finally get into senior hockey in 1902-03. And the key thing about senior hockey is, the better caliber of play, but only senior teams are allowed to challenge for the Stanley Cup. So they know going into the 1902-03 season that if they win the Manitoba Championship, they will have a chance to challenge for the Stanley Cup. And they expect to win, and they do. It's funny, the season is extremely short that year. So it's hard to wrap your head around, like, they played 6 games to win that championship and, challenge for the Stanley Cup. But Ottawa in the Silver Seven, is funny, like, nobody ever looks back on that and thinks they are unworthy of being champions because they're such a famous team, but they're hardly playing any games either. I mean, it's funny, like, if you think about football, like Super Bowl team plays, now 17 games in the playoffs, which is a heck of a lot different than the 82 in hockey or the 162 in baseball. But still, it's like a 6-game season qualifies you for the Stanley Cup. But it did. Those were the rules, and they were good, and nobody denied that they were good. So they win the championship, which they've expected to win all year. And because of all the changes in the leagues, the Thistles executives have been in constant contact with the Stanley Cup trustees to make sure that in this new league they'll still be eligible to challenge, and they were. And they go down to Ottawa, and they don't win that one, and they aren't even all that close in that one. I don't know if there's anything specific you want to ask about that series, but I'll let you jump in before I just start yapping about 1903.
Well, here's one thing. So this, I'm told, is the Rat Portage Rowing Club. Tommy Phillips and Cy Griffiths are 2 of the rowers, first and second positions there.
The guy behind Griffiths is actually the goalie for the Thistles in 1903 and 1904, but not by the time of the Stanley Cup team.
And so these guys who played hockey, they were kind of around each other, I'm guessing, pretty much all year.
Well, in Rat Portage and Kenora, for sure, because it's such a small town. I mean, I don't talk about it much in the book, but they played baseball together. A lot of the guys on the team rowed in the summer. That was the big summer sport in Kenora on the Lake of the Woods, was rowing. So yeah, they're around each other a lot. I mean, some of them work in the same once they're old enough to go to work, because then, they're barely in their 20s in 1902-03 when they first played for the Stanley Cup. This picture is probably from 1905, but even at that, Griffiths and Phillips are 22. They competed against Ottawa in the Royal Canadian Henley that year in rowing and for the Stanley Cup in hockey. So it's kind of neat. I mean, it was a small athletic world, I guess.
So the Thistles lose their first Stanley Cup bid. The old chestnut is, well, you got to learn how to lose before you win. In 1905, as you mentioned, the Thistles challenge for the Stanley Cup again against Ottawa. They actually win the first game, and then the skullduggery begins.
Yes, perhaps.
All right. Perhaps, legend and reality. You write, quote, the Ottawa ice crew at Days Arena, or possibly even the Ottawa fans, salted the playing surface in a deliberate attempt to slow down the Thistles in Game 2.
Yeah, so we'll set the tone a little bit. By 1904-05, the Thistles have all their star guys back. Like in 203, 03, 04, Tommy Phillips had actually left town, and so he wasn't even there with the first Stanley Cup challenge. But now Phillips is back in town leading the team. Hooper is there, McGimpsey's there, Griffiths is there. Those are the four Kenora kids who go on to the Hall of Fame. Boudreau's there. Their new goalie is Eddie Giroux from Toronto, who does move and live in Kenora, so he's not quite a ringer. So they are a very powerful team in 1904-05, and they run roughshod over the Manitoba League and come to Ottawa to play. Ottawa has won the Stanley Cup 2 years in a row now. This is their third year as champions. Earlier in the year, they have crushed Dawson City in that famous Stanley Cup challenge in which the Klondike team comes to Ottawa and gets hammered, and Frank McGee scores the 14 goals. So this is Frank McGee and Ottawa against Tommy Phillips and Rat Portage, the two teams that are pretty much acknowledged as the best teams in the country at this time. This is the 04-05 team. Phillips rather, and Frank McGee in Ottawa are 1-2 or 2-1 in your arguments as to who are the two best players in hockey. This sort of Ovechkin Crosby comparison. And Kenora, they're Kenora now. Actually, they aren't. They won't be Kenora until the end of the season, so they're still Rat Porters when they're playing this series. They come to town pretty high on themselves, unlike in 02-03, where, yeah, they really were sort of there to learn the first time. And they win the first game of the series is it 9-2 or 9-3? I should have this stuff right in top. But they win handily and have skated them off the ice. Ottawa, yeah, so the story's about salting the ice. I mean, the newspapers in Winnipeg hate Ottawa because they've beaten up on some of the Winnipeg teams over the years. Toronto papers too. They're telling stories about they salted the ice. They deliberately salted the ice. The Thistles never claimed that happened. They were willing to believe that perhaps on a warm night, the ice was flooded a little later into the evening than it should have been and didn't have time to set properly. The other thing is that this season in Manitoba, they had come up with what they called the two-referee system, similar to what we have now, except there were no linesmen. There were just the two referees. Hockey was generally had one referee calling the game. But in Manitoba, they had two for the reasons you might think, because, one guy can sort of watch for the rough stuff behind the play when the action's going on in front of the other guy at the other end. And Ottawa and Kenora, when they challenged for the Stanley Cup, respectfully requested that we use the two referee system for this. And Ottawa was like, no, I don't think we're going to do that. And they eventually agreed that there'd be the two referee system for the first game, which Kenora wins in a romp. The one referee system in the second game, which regardless of the ice, which was probably soft, but may or may not have been deliberate, the game was rough. And then Ottawa used the one referee to do the rough stuff they were famous for. Cy Griffiths years later would talk about, this being the roughest game he ever played in, and that years later he still felt like he carried the wounds from that game. And Ottawa wins. Ottawa wins 4-2. So it sets up a third and final game. And for that one, they have agreed that they'll use two referees for the first half and one referee for the second. And interestingly, Kenora is winning at halftime and loses the game. Though there's little talk that game was particularly rough. It was really just the two best teams in hockey going at it, hammer and tong. And Ottawa wins it in the dying seconds, but the Thistles all sort of maintain, if the game had just like 2 minutes more, we'd have caught them and beat them. There's no way to prove that. And others were saying, if they played on neutral ice with referees that weren't afraid to make the calls against Ottawa, they'd win. And there was a couple of games played in Winnipeg between the two teams in 1906, and Kenora now wins them both, but it wasn't quite the same competition as the Stanley Cup. But that was a big thing in 1905, was like Kenora insisting if we get a fair shake, we can beat them, and then nobody really believing they got the fair shake they were hoping for.
Let me take you off on a bit of a tangent because you mentioned
tangents are us.
The quality of the ice, and elsewhere in the book, and I don't know the context, but it doesn't really matter, but the Toronto newspapers are talking about how the ice for a certain game was more suitable for aquatic sports than anything else. And the other, that was the Globe, the Toronto Star included cartoons of players in water over their heads, spectators fishing, the referee in a canoe, and the rink marquee advertising water polo tonight.
Yeah, the Thistles, after the Stanley Cup Series, played a couple exhibition games in Toronto, and the weather was not natural ice hockey weather. It's interesting that, Toronto was sort of behind Winnipeg and Ottawa and Montreal in the early days. And it was mostly because, Toronto, it's still Canada and it's fairly far north, but Toronto is considerably south of those cities, and they couldn't always count on good winter hockey weather in Toronto, and it kind of held them back. And this is why, the games had to be squeezed in when they could. So you don't have Stanley Cup games. Though, interestingly, in Ottawa in 1903, when Kenora Rat Portage is there, the weather's pretty warm too, and that kind of plays havoc with the Thistles style. Because on soft ice with their sharp and better skates, it's actually a handicap for them because they can't push off and dig in and cut and turn and skate the way they're used to. So bad ice is bad for the Thistles.
Again, it reminds me of a baseball analogy. If you're trying to counter a fast team, you water the infield.
Yeah, no, it's very similar. Like that for sure. If Ottawa, as I say, I'm doubtful they actually salted the ice, but I am prepared to believe, as I think Cy Griffiths was, that they watered the surface too late in the game and it didn't set. And it was definitely it's not so much that it's an advantage for Ottawa as it's a disadvantage for the Thistles.
And in hockey, you hear it in 2022. If you're a fast skating team, you want to play on good ice. You want to play in the Edmontons of the NHL and not at Madison Square Garden. And whether it was intentional or not, soft ice was going to affect the Thistles, who were usually the best skating team.
For sure. Yep.
So, to put a bow on the 05 series, so Ottawa wins game 3 and they win the series 2-1. They win game 3, 5-4. And the Ottawa captain, you quote him as saying, the hardest game we ever had. And he went on to say, and I think this is wonderful, the town of Rat Portage has an aggregation it can well be proud of. Game to the core. Not a man showed the white feather.
Yeah, people, you don't hear that kind of talk these days. They might say similar things, but not in that kind of flowery language. Everyone was a poet.
Isn't that something? Not a man showed the white feather.
The white feather's a big thing in sort of British Empire mythology, right? It's like, like they would hand white feathers to people they thought were shirking in, by the First World War and stuff like that. And there's a movie, I think it's with Heath Ledger in it, and it's not very good, but I think it might even be called The White Feather. It's all about how like these British Empire soldiers, like it was a shameful thing to show the white feather.
There's a subplot both in 1906 and also throughout your book that is truly fascinating. And on the way to the Thistles' third kick at the cup, you write, there's a growing tension between supporters of amateur and professional hockey, and it's finally reaching a crisis point. So tell me about the amateurs, the professionals, how hockey was changing, and how that was coming to a head in 06.
Well, it's interesting. It's you dirty Americans, spoiling our game as it still is today. Um, teams
Sorry.
Teams in the United States by around 1901 are starting to pay Canadians to come down and play. And even at that, they're probably doing it sneakily. They might not be actually, here is a salary to play, but hey, come down and have a cushy off-ice job that will leave you all the time you need to play hockey for our team. And that was sort of how they skirted the rules in Canada. Even though, there were Canadian leagues, especially the Ontario Hockey League was the most, or the Ontario Hockey Association was the most staunchly amateur and kind of determined to root out professionalism and would ban people if they felt they had taken money to play hockey. So the fallacy about, it wasn't money for hockey, it was money for a job. They're just coming to play hockey. But that started happening in Canada too. It becomes even more prevalent in Manitoba, I think, than it was in the East, though Eastern teams are starting to do it as well. But like in 1903-04, Joe Hall and a couple of other guys from Brandon show up with the Winnipeg Rowing Club that year. And the papers are very sarcastic in oh yeah, sure, they came for a new job. And it just so happens they'll go out for the hockey team. So yeah, there's Joe on the Winnipeg Rowing Club.
Okay, wait, you said you didn't say the Winnipeg Rolling Papers, did you?
Well, it's interesting, right? Like sports clubs were sports clubs then. I make that point in the book somewhere too, that it was like being a member of a sports club was more like having a membership at a gym. It wasn't the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Montreal Canadiens, the Boston Bruins, and an entity and a monolith unto themselves. I mean, it was a sports club, So this was, well, it's funny, like the Rat Portage Rowing Club is separate from the Rat Portage hockey team, but all the guys are playing the same sport. It just so happens in Winnipeg, the rowing club decides, well, this winter we should have a hockey team too. It'll keep our guys in shape for the rowing season, is ostensibly. Like that's how the Toronto Argonauts football team starts. I mean, they're the Argonauts rowing club, but football will keep us in shape when we can't be rowing. So yeah, they're the Winnipeg Rowing Club, which I kind of forget already that people kind of find that hilarious. But but that is the team. They are the Winnipeg Rowing Club. And they are, even though they become sort of staunch defenders of amateurism themselves, because I guess they would tell you, we didn't pay them to play hockey. He came for a better job and just happened to join the hockey team, which was true, except people were starting to become increasingly unhappy with that too. It's like, come on, you can say that's amateurism, but it's not. And it's funny that in Eastern Canada, they're very snooty about it. Like the British position, even though Britons have been paying guys to play soccer since the 1880s, but the sort of amateur aristocratic position is, sport for sport's sake. We should do this for the exercise and the fun and the competition, not for money. In Eastern Canada, they still seem to believe this. In Western Canada, because it's kind of more of the pioneer spirit, it's not quite the Wild West that the States is, but it's wilder West than the East is. They're starting to, like, the thing in the East is like they're angry anybody's being paid. In the West, they're more angry that they're lying about people being paid than that they're being paid. And it all comes to a head in sort of the fall of 1906. I mean, it's known in the Eastern leagues that Montreal Wanderers want to bring in a couple of these guys who've been playing professionally in the States, Riley Hearn, the goalie, and Hod Stewart. And to do that, and it's the other thing about this era too, is like if one professional plays on an amateur team, it taints the entire amateur team. And if one amateur team or one professional team plays against an amateur team, even if none of them are being paid, it taints their amateurism. And because they paid against professionals, they can be deemed professional and tossed out of their league. And guys who were like, this becomes an issue for all these guys who are rowers, because rowing remains staunchly amateur. And so some of these guys are like, I don't want to take money. I don't want to be known taking money to play hockey because then I can't row in the summers. Though the Winnipeg papers, when this all comes to a head, believe if it comes to a choice between the Stanley Cup and the Henley Regatta, they're all going to choose the Stanley Cup. But it's a major issue in Canadian sports. Again, it's like the LIV and the PGA, the NHL and the WHA. It's just a real kind of philosophical fight. Should this league go pro? if it goes pro, can they play against amateurs? And there are even amateur supporters who believe, yes, you should be able to play amateurs and pros together. We will just designate who is receiving money and who is not, so that, you could still row if you didn't receive money, even if you played on an amateur team. But the staunch amateurs are still against this. But the hockey leagues decide, not all of them, some of them remain amateur, and it does split. Some of the teams leave the pro leagues and go to the amateur leagues. But the main leagues basically decide the fans don't care if they're getting money, the players are being paid or not. They just want to see the best hockey. And to ensure the best hockey, we have to pay these guys. And it becomes a real philosophical debate. Like, people are worried that we're asking these young guys in their early 20s, when normally they'd be sort of establishing themselves in a career. We ask them to take time away from their jobs. We ask them to go to practice every night. We ask them to play every game. When they don't play every game, we accuse them of being disloyal to the team and their hometown and wah. I mean, how can we honestly say they shouldn't be paid when we're making all these demands on them? It's funny, like, even today, like, I feel like if there's all this money in baseball or in hockey or in football, I'd rather see the players getting it than the owners. I'm not going to a game. I'm not turning it on to watch an owner own. I watch sports to see the players play. And it was sort of the same thing, except that in this era, the salaries are, like $600 to $1,800. Nobody's making, life-altering money. I mean, this is like the most money a pro athlete's going to get is, comparable to what a lawyer or a doctor would make. But it's not, but a lawyer and a doctor can do that from 25 to 65 or 85. A hockey player only has a short lifespan. So we're asking them to give up times where they might be establishing themselves in a lifetime career. So we have to pay them. Yeah, and even at that, when they're being paid, some guys are choosing to retire at 26 and 27 because they're like, I can't, this is not how I can't take care of my family for a lifetime on my $2,000 hockey earnings for 4 years. I need to establish myself in a career. So it's become a big thing. And by the 1906-07 season, when the teams are going pro, and people are unhappy about it, but people like it's an interesting thing. Like, even though Kenora is now paying their players, and for the Stanley Cup Series, they bring in Art Ross from Brandon and pay him openly, and they bring in Joe Hall and pay him, even though he doesn't actually play. But because the bulk of this team is still these guys who all grew up together, people kind of rally around them. They like the idea of, well, yeah, they're being paid to play now, but they're still the Thistles we like and the hometown guys. And so people are still fans. It kind of and their sportsmanship, the fact that they aren't as dirty as other teams has endeared them to fans too. So they're kind of the darlings, even the people who are holding their nose and accepting professionalism, they still will accept that at least the Thistles are kind of doing it right. They're not just throwing money at free agents and bringing them in, even though by the time that season plays out, they're starting to do that quite a bit to try and keep their heads above water and keep competitive, because in a small town, it's hard to match what they can do in a bigger city.
I'm very glad that you also brought in the current day, when the sham of amateurism is still debated. And here in the States, college football players with name, image, and likeness, all it's doing is replacing the Cadillac or the Mustang or whatever car was given to the college football quarterback under the table, and probably still is. And in your lyrical turn of phrase, it was always thus. Look what happened to Jim Thorpe and his medals for the most innocuous and unrelated quote unquote professionalism that caused him for many decades to lose his medals. And we see it here in hockey at the turn of the 20th century too. And somebody who you quote in the book is the Stanley Cup trustee, P.D. Ross. And like you brought up, he says, quote, "We expect the athlete to give up several hours a day to keep himself in the pink of condition, and we slam him for his lack of local patriotism and gratitude for the applause we have bestowed upon him."
Yeah, so it's like, and how dare you now want money for all these things? I mean, and it's funny, like Ross would have happily held out for amateurism, but he just couldn't see how you could do it ethically. Like it made no sense to him. like, we can't deny these people money and expect the things we're expecting from them. And even though, as I say, he would have loved for the games to remain amateur, and it was a big stink. Like, what if the Stanley Cup team, if these teams go pro, will they still be allowed to play for the Stanley Cup, or will the trustees, pull it back and demand it be for amateurs? But Ross, interestingly, though it was against what he really wanted, he had sort of promised as a trustee to Lord Stanley that this will always be the most important trophy in hockey. And so, if the best teams are going pro, the Stanley Cup should go pro too, because that's where the best teams are and where the best hockey will be. But it's interesting too, so when the Grey Cup comes around a couple of years later, and the Minto Cup, no, the Minto Cup had already been. When the Grey Cup comes around and people are debating, like Canadian football stayed amateur for quite a number of years. And Ross sort of suggested to the trustees, like, if you want this to be an amateur trophy, write it right in the deed of gift, or it is an amateur trophy, because there was nothing about that in Stanley Cup. Like, the actual early terms said, if someday a new league comes around that's better than any of these current leagues, this trophy should be awarded to them. And so Ross was very diligent about making sure the Stanley Cup stayed as the top trophy front and center in hockey. And if it meant going pro, it meant going pro.
Well, these days, NHL players are playing in the Olympics, and NBA players are playing in the Olympics. So
yeah, and sprinters make millions and millions of dollars. I mean, shot putters might not, but there's plenty of money for what used to be amateur athletes. And as again, like, it's a guy making more money in a night than I make in a lifetime at half my age, I can't say that I go, well, good for you. But again, like, I'm not there to watch owners own. I mean, if there's that much money in the game, I want to see the players get it. Though it doesn't thrill me that, I'd like to see authors get it too. But we, a few of us do, but most don't. I'm not making Stephen King money. Stephen King is, like, in a court case now where he's kind of holding out for the small publishers and the small authors. So he stays, I don't know, like, I don't think pro athletes are looking out for the young guys, even though they, like, they're always the ones who get thrown under the bus in the contract negotiations, or the CBA negotiations. But
yeah, the old timers, the retired players from decades past, don't get looked after either.
No, but I think I'm sure they all would have loved to have made the money these guys make, but I don't think they begrudge these guys. I mean, and they might go, well, where was my chance? Or, it would be nice if you were helping us out a little bit more. And I think they try to, but yeah, it's, I guess perhaps in the discussion afterwards, we might have a few old timers who tell us what, how the unions are looking out for them or not. But, yeah, there's no reason why. I don't know. I am a bit of a socialist that way. It's like, if there's all this money, we should float all boats, not just the richest rich.
A rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah,
John Kennedy.
And it does in a sense, but it lifts some boats higher.
Well, I think that was an Animal Farm, all boats are equal, but some boats are more equal than others.
Yeah.
So we arrive at January of 1907. The Kenora Thistles travel to Montreal to meet the Wanderers. The Wanderers, they're the type of team that likes to roam around. They're never in one place. They roam from town to town.
It's interesting that there are a lot of sports teams called the Wanderers at this time. And I've heard stories that, they chose the name because they were going to wander here and there to challenge for the Stanley Cup. I don't think that's true. But I don't really know why so many teams were called Wanderers. But yeah, it's an odd name too. Thistles is, I guess, a bit of an odd name as well.
Okay, so we brought up earlier the rough play, and specifically the Ottawa Silver Seven. Now, the Wanderers earned the right to play Kenora by beating Ottawa, but absorb a literal beating in the process. You show in the book the Montreal Star, quoting one former player saying, "It was the worst exhibition of butchery they ever saw. What happened?
The Wanderers and the Ottawa play in the same league in the East and have in a couple of different leagues. They are, I mean, the best analogy I can think of for hockey people is they're the Red Wings in Colorado in the late 90s. Like, they really don't like each other. And the Wanderers are considered a clean team, but they do get into some pretty rough games with Ottawa, mostly defending themselves. But it is so they have beaten Ottawa for the league championship the previous year and taken over the Stanley Cup, and now have the right to entertain the challenge from Kenora. But like the week before the game is going to be played, a regular league game between Ottawa and Montreal is that game you're describing. And it's sort of said that, I mean, for whatever reason, even though it would make more sense for Ottawa if the Wanderers win the Stanley Cup and keep the trophy in their league, and they can beat out the Wanderers and win it back that year, so they'd happily go to Kenora to challenge for it if they have to. It's like they are thought to have beaten up on the Wanderers in this last regular season game before the Stanley Cup challenge in order to weaken them, so that they will be at a disadvantage playing against the Thistles. I mean, again, you can't prove that. It is a lot of, like, again, it's the Ottawa Montreal paper saying it was the roughest game in ever, and they're all horrible. And the Ottawa paper's going, shut up. Like, you're whining. There are some things. This is one of my favorite quotes in all of hockey. When in the 1904 series with the Toronto Marlboros and Ottawa, and after the first game that Ottawa, beats them badly and beats them physically, and the Toronto papers are, oh my God, it was the worst thing we've ever seen. And when Ottawa wins the second game under much more even tactics, and they report that the squealers at Squealville on the Dawn got it good and hard last night when we played clean hockey. It's like, I love that they're calling Toronto Squealville on the Dawn. And so, like, the Ottawa papers support their guys. But yeah, it does seem like they beat up on the Wanderers before the series, though I don't know how much impact it actually had. I mean, only one guy was said to have been hurt badly enough that he didn't play, but even still, I mean, it's pretty, I don't know, juvenile if they really did that.
Meanwhile, the Thistles miss their intended train connection in Chicago, and thank goodness they did.
Yeah, it's interesting. So their train car, they left from Winnipeg, not on the CPR through Canada, but down through the States, through Minneapolis and Chicago and Detroit, and then cross at Windsor and come across that way. And they missed the connection leaving one of the, maybe even when they left Winnipeg, right from the beginning, they were late. And their car was to be a special rail car attached to the back of the train. And they were late leaving. And when they get to Chicago, I think, they learned that the train that had left Minneapolis, that they were supposed to be the last train on, had been wrecked from behind, had been smashed by another train coming in and wrecked the last train car. I don't know if there were deaths or not, but it certainly would have delayed the trip and maybe put it off. Yeah, it's a little bit of a quirk, I guess. And, it could have been over before it even started.
In game one in Montreal between the Thistles and the Wanderers, Thistles win 4-2. And a player you've mentioned, Tommy Phillips, scores all 4 goals for the Thistles. Let's talk about Tommy for a second. A Calgary writer said, quote, he had it all. Fast, clean, a brilliant stick handler, and one of the greatest wing shots that ever stormed the net. And is it true that Tommy Phillips, after 1904, played despite missing part of 3 fingers on one hand?
It seems to be true. I mean, there are stories in the paper, like he worked in the lumber business, and that he apparently lost like the tips of, I guess, maybe these fingers, or I don't know, in a saw accident. I've looked very close at his fingers in pictures from years after that. There is the one picture of the 1906 team. It's in the book. I probably should have sent you that. I didn't think about it. Like, you can see he's wearing some kind of leather contraption, not like on his hand, like not a glove. And it does look like one artificial finger and a couple of. I don't know, but in other pictures you don't really see it. But that was the story, that he lost the tops of 3 fingers in a sawing accident, in a milling accident, in a lumber mill. but it doesn't seem to have held him back. I mean, he was. I mean, as I say, I compare the Thistles to the Oilers a bunch in the book, and if that's the case, he is their Wayne Gretzky. But I don't think he's Wayne Gretzky. But I think he's Sidney Crosby, like the Crosby Ovechkin comparison of Frank McGee and Phillips, I think, is a good one. They don't play the right positions quite to match up, but I think he even looks a little like Phillips, like Crosby. He's Sidney Crosby. I mean, he's the best player in the game, or at least the second best player in the game, and works hard at it. You know, like Crosby. I'm a big Tommy Phillips fan. I mean, he's dead 40 years before I was born, but I'm a big fan.
Prior to Game 2, there's drama about whether a Montreal player, his name was Russell Bowie, whether they would have his services.
Yeah, he was one of these guys that was a staunch amateur. But after the Kenora won the first game, the Wanderers go to him. He plays for the Montreal Victorias and offer him money, and he apparently accepts. He said later it wasn't so much for the money, but the honor of keeping the Stanley Cup in Montreal. But on game night, he decided not to. I mean, it's said maybe his family talked him out of it. It's unclear, really. And he returned the money. But then it's interesting, like the pro amateur thing. Like he was called before the Canadian Amateur Athletic Union to explain. Did you take the money? Did you? And they had to determine what his status would be as an athlete going forward. And it was ruled that, he gave back the money. He didn't play, so we should keep him as an amateur. But it was a big to-do. And the Wanderers were pretty annoyed that he I'll play. No, last minute he sort of didn't. And so they were kind of put out. But it's interesting that later they're annoyed about some of the players that Kenora is bringing in for their rematch in March. And it rarely comes up, though sometimes, that, you guys were trying to make last-minute adjustments too. So, to you.
Well, Kenora wins Game 2 and wins the 2-game series. They win Game 2 8-6 with a little help from a torn pair of pants.
Yeah, I'd never seen that story before, and I only found it sort of late in the game while writing this. Yeah, I won't go into it in too much detail, but Jack Marshall, who was playing for Montreal and was actually not one of their regulars, was brought in with some injuries and some changes. So apparently, so Kenora had been up 6-2 into games were played in 2 halves instead of 3 periods in these days. We're up 6-2 well into the second half, and suddenly Montreal gets on a roll and scores 4 goals and ties it up. And the referee, who was telling the story a little bit later, says he feels like the momentum had completely shifted. The Wanderers were on a roll, and as they're starting, there's only a couple of minutes left in the game, and he figures they're just going to steamroll them now at this point and win the game and force a third game in the series. But the play starts, and Jack Marshall apparently, tears the suspenders or rips something in his pants, and his pants are going, and he hollering at the referee, blow your whistle. And the ref blows it down and goes, what's up? He says, man, my pants are falling down. And so they took a timeout so that he could get his pants repaired. And the referee really felt like that gave the Thistles the breather they needed, the couple of minutes, and they regrouped and they scored 2 late goals and won the game. And I had never heard that story. I mean, I knew how the game had gone, but I'd never seen that story. But it was in a Winnipeg paper in March of 1907, reflecting back 2 months ago. And yeah, I mean, it was hard to actually fit it in, because first I had it written as the game was going on, but it kind of broke the rhythm of what was the game story. So I told it later as it actually had appeared anyway. So I think it, win-win. But yeah, I'd never heard that story, but it appears to be true.
Kenora wins the Stanley Cup. They win Game 2 8-6. They win the Stanley Cup. And you write, quote, one of the greatest underdog stories in Canadian sports. Sort of.
Well, it's I don't think the Thistles, the fact that they're a town of 6,000 beating a town of 500,000 makes it an underdog story and a bit of David and Goliath. But everybody knows the Thistles are I mean, it's, like, yeah, the Green Bay Packers an underdog story every time they win the Super Bowl. I mean, everybody knows this is a hockey town. This is a football town. This is, they're small, but the community rallies around this team. So I don't feel like it's a true underdog story. It's not, as I often say, it's not like, Bismarck, North Dakota goes to New York and beats the Yankees for the World Series. It's a team everybody knows is great. I mean, it just so happens they come from a small town. It really is the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, Edmonton in the 1980s is a heck of a lot bigger than Kenora in 1907, but it's still a lot smaller than Boston and New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. But were the Oilers an underdog team? I don't know. I mean, they're a plucky small town group that put together a great team. And I think that's more what the Thistles are than an underdog story.
You're right. The Stanley Cup likely arrived. The actual Stanley Cup arrived in Kenora sometime between February 9th and the 13th. And after the reception, it was displayed for the whole town to see in the window of Johnson's Pharmacy. So,
that was fairly normal of the time. Like, it was always in a shop window somewhere prominent in Quebec or Montreal or Ottawa.
So in the movie version of this story, Kenora comes home, the players, conquering champions, fade to black.
Instead, it would be nice to do that.
But their reign only lasts 63 days. So what happened?
Well, the Wanderers were good. I mean, that's really what happens. I mean, the Wanderers that year are 10-0 in their regular season, which is fairly unheard of in this era. I mean, even the Thistles have never gone through a season undefeated. So they're a good team. But it's too bad. I mean, it'd be nice if they won a couple more years, or if they just sort of could like win and retire from hockey. But in March, there is a rematch. The Wanderers win the championship of the Eastern Canada Amateur Hockey Association, which is now a professional league, but still has amateur in their title. And they challenge for the Stanley Cup, and they are going to come back to Kenora and play them. Though in the Manitoba League, it's quite the dogfight between Brandon, Portage La Prairie, and Kenora. The Thistles, I mean, there's too much to go into, like how the season was sort of oddball and the shape of the schedule. But the Thistles, a lot of guys got hurt. I mean, the Billy McGinty got hurt in the exhibition game in Ottawa after the Stanley Cup. Hooper got hurt in the game in Toronto after the Stanley Cup, and they canceled the other exhibition games they were going to play to get the hell back home and recruit more players. So they're working the phones to bring in guys. They bring in a couple of new ringers from Ottawa. They can't get the Brandon guys because they're fighting against Brandon in their league championship. So the Thistles were a bit beat up. They might have got a little bit unlucky. They got beaten badly in the first game of the rematch. This one was a total goals series. The others had been 2 out of 3. And so they had a lot of, they lost, what's the score? 6-2? They're down 5 goals, 7-2, I guess, in the first game. And so now they're down 5 goals in the second game, which is a lot to make up, but not unheard of in this era. But they don't have it. The second game is a tremendous game. The Thistles win 6-5. If there could have been a third game, they might have won and won anyway. Certainly people seem to think, and again, it's soft ice. Soft ice hurts them in the first game. Though the Wanderers claim like they could have used soft ice was no help for them either. But people seem to believe like if the conditions had been better the night of the first game, they probably would have won anyway. But it was a lot of kind of bad luck, a lot of injuries, a lot of juggling the roster, and then conditions that weren't really favorable to them. And it's too, like, if they'd won the cup in 1905, they probably would have successfully defended a bunch of challengers in 1906. They probably would have hung on throughout 1907. Some of the players who then leave after that season might not, if they're still like 3-time defending Stanley Cup champions. Like, they could have been the greatest rivalry in early hockey if things had gone their way. Instead, they are sort of the shortest reign as Stanley Cup champions, but which is somewhat fitting for the smallest town. But it does sort of wreck the movie aspect a little bit, that the glorious rise to winning, boom, just kind of drops off pretty quickly. But I didn't feel like you could just end the story with the win. You had to tell the whole story. So,
well, tell me briefly here, how close did the Stanley Cup come to getting tossed into Lake of the Woods, never to be seen again.
Yeah, that is a story that is told over the years. That so the Wanderers and the Thistles are wrangling about all again. As I said, people fight about everything. Where the game should be played. The Wanderers want to play in Winnipeg because it's a bigger rink and they'll draw bigger gate receipts. The Thistles want to play in their home rink because they have some home ice advantages and they feel like their fans deserve it. So they're fighting about where the game should be played. They're fighting about if these new players Kenora brought in should be allowed to play in the series. Fight. And apparently there were meetings and bitching and arguments to the point that one of the guys who ran the Thistles club was so frustrated he picked up the Stanley Cup off the table where it was being displayed. Why the trophy would be in the middle of the room while they're having these arguments, who knows? They weren't having the arguments in the Johnson brothers window. Pick up the trophy and was going to storm out. And when people said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I don't care about the $1,000 bond we're supposed to pay for its safekeeping. I'm tossing it in the lake and no one's ever going to see it again." It's told a lot, though it's mostly told by the same person over and over. So it's hard to know if it's really true, but it's possible. I mean, I'd put more stake in that than some of the other rumors that get told about things going on in these days. But I can't swear. I wouldn't swear on a stack of Bibles it really happened, but it could have.
Last two questions as we wrap up our time together.
Yeah, it's been a long time, but I'm having fun. I hope people are enjoying it.
I am.
Good.
Sadder than losing back the cup so quickly. You write, less than a year after winning the ultimate prize, Kenora, and I'm going to put up a picture of the town that you gave me. Less than a year later, Kenora was no longer able to compete compete as a professional team. So that's really the sad part.
Yes, I mean this is again like the Edmonton Oilers, right? I mean the Oilers kind of priced themselves out of business, right? Like Gretzky could command so much money and the other guys could too, and Pocklington couldn't sustain it in a small market like Edmonton. I mean, by 1906-07 season, the game is now openly professional. And again, as I say, like at the end of the year, a couple of the Thistles' top players retire because it's time to go into business. We've achieved what we wanted in hockey. It's time to establish ourselves in life. Though at least one of them does come back a few years later and is still, this is Cy Griffith, and is still a great start. Tommy Phillips, on the other hand, like this is his last chance to sort of cash in on hockey, and he signs a big contract in Ottawa. Apparently, the Wanderers and the Ottawa were in a real fight for his services, and they're going to pay him $1,800, the highest contract in hockey history, which has only been a professional game for 1 year. To come to Ottawa and play. And so he does. And the Thistles can't replace him. I mean, more so than the Oilers. The Oilers at least got Jimmy Carson and some guys when they traded Gretzky. I mean, Phillips basically leaves as a free agent because there's no such thing as trades really at this point. And they can't replace him. They can't replace Griffiths. They can't replace Roxy Boudreau. The first game of the new season, the scores are reported in various papers as 14-1, 15-1, and 16-1. And the Kenora paper says, it's as if we reached the highest summit in hockey and fell off the other end. And it was really like that. And they postponed their next couple of games as they're trying to scramble and rearrange the team and realize they can't and withdraw from the Manitoba League and would never again. Kenora teams would play amateur and even compete for the Allen Cup in the early days. But they were never able to compete for the Stanley Cup, and really no small town ever was. Edmonton tried, and Edmonton in 1907-08 is only about 20,000 people, so it's bigger than Kenora, but it's not, it's not a very big city yet. Renfrew tried and couldn't really. The Maritime teams had a couple of challenges for the Stanley Cup. No, it was now professional sport and big business, and the smaller communities become amateur centers and the big cities become pro. And then the game has never really gone back. And it's as long ago as 1907 that this sort of happens and at least starts to happen. And it happens pretty quickly.
Fortunately, that's not quite the end of the story. You visited Kenora in 2007 when the town held a centennial celebration for their Stanley Cup championship team. So in the 21st century, how does Kenora regard the Thistles?
I think that there are people in Kenora who are very proud of all this. I haven't been back since then, and because of COVID, it was difficult to get up there now. When in the last year or two, when I've been doing the book, at least I've been able to phone and email and chat with people. I hope to go up this fall when the book goes into wide release, and we'll have a launch, and we'll do some things in Kenora. But I mean, certainly I know people in Kenora who are incredibly proud and wish the city did even more to market the fact that they are the smallest town ever to win the Stanley Cup. I mean, yes, they have this plaque downtown, and there are people in Kenora who know the story well and are quite proud of it. But even in 2007, when they did it, I know that there were people who were also annoyed that they didn't make it, like they were sort of too modest about it. They didn't think, oh, the NHL won't care, people won't want to come. I mean, I know like Billy McGimsey's family is still angry that they weren't sort of formally invited to come, and they didn't even know about it till after it was over. And of course they would have come. I hope that Lindo will come when I'm up there in the fall. So, I mean, it's a bit of a small town underdog story still. Like, they're proud of it, but they don't like to brag, I guess. I mean, it's like, I don't think enough of them realize what an amazing thing it is they have.
Well, as we say goodbye, I'll let you brag, and deservedly so, over engraved in history, the story of the Kenora Thistles. Tell us when and where and how this book can be gotten and enjoyed, and anything else that we may have left out that you want to mention as we say goodbye.
Really, as I was just starting to say, the book will be sort of in wide release by the fall. Hopefully you'll be able to get it on Amazon or at a bookstore near you. Right now, it's basically like if you go to my website, which is there, ericzweig.com, you'll see some stories I've posted recently about the book and how to get it. On the books page on my site, you'll see a link. So really the easiest place, and unless you're in Kenora, the only place that you can get it is if you go to a website, ratportagepress.com. It's basically the only thing on the website is to sell this book. So you can go there and buy it right now. I mean, I know that there'll be people who want to wait and hope it's on Amazon because, you know, the Amazon's evil, though. But the shipping is better. The price, you know, if you probably have your ability to get free shipping if you've got a Prime membership or blah, blah, blah. But if you want the book right now, ratportagepress.com is the best way. You can also order it through Elizabeth Campbell Books in Kenora. And if you're in Kenora, it's available in a bunch of places. If you're in Owen Sound, where I live, you can get it in the bookstore here. But the website is the best way to go, or my website will link you to it as well.
Eric, I can't thank you enough. This was tremendous fun. Everyone who, thinks they know about the Stanley Cup, everyone who enjoys watching the Stanley Cup now knows more, and will know a lot more, because there's still a lot we didn't cover that's wonderful stuff in the book, and everybody ought to pick it up and learn the things you found out that kind of ended your lifetime vision quest to turn a little toy into a story that turned this into
here's my book,
the alchemy into a book. That's the alpha and omega of
something.
Kenora Thistles. So thank you, Eric. We enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. Thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed it. I hope other people did too.
Okay. Good night.